Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, Sandy. Hi, everyone.
Sarah and I have spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the U.S. and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we're sharing our insights, experiences, and knowledge to inspire leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice. And today, we're going to focus on understanding something I think is the most important thing that people need to understand, which is traumatic reenactment. And I say that because it can be really the key to helping people to recover from trauma, and because it's a really useful way to understand social history as well, in light of everything that's going on around us. Everybody's heard the saying, history repeats, although Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. But most people may not really recognize how that happens in the lives of all of us as individuals as well. So with it first, let's start, Sarah, with a definition.
Good call.
Reenactment is the unconscious. Now, I underscore that. So when we're reenacting something, we don't realize it. That's a big part of the problem. It's the unconscious repetition of painful or negative relationships that then become ingrained patterns over time that we keep repeating with other individuals, and even groups do this as well. So we don't see it. And yet, if you look back at relationships you've had, maybe especially if they were problematic relationships, you might see that it keeps happening over and over again and wonder why. Freud, good old Sigmund, he called it the repetition compulsion. And he and his contemporaries, like Pierre Genet, knew that it had something to do with memory, with the processing of memory. And he very famously said, this is a quote from him, "The patient cannot remember the whole of what is repressed in him, and what he cannot remember may be precisely the essential part of it. He's obliged to repeat the repressed material as a contemporary experience instead of remembering it as something in the past." And the way the famous Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana wrote about it in 1905, before both world wars, he said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." But really, I didn't learn throughout all of my training and experience, I didn't really learn much about it in the lives of how it was really affecting our people that we were working with, until I began learning about traumatic reenactment.
Yeah, this was true for me too. Where I saw it first and firsthand was in my work with young children. And in the program that I was running, we served kids who primarily had the experience of sexual abuse. And what we saw was, what we described as being sexually reactive. And that basically meant, that they were kind of replicating sexual interactions, both with other children and with adults. And, that's really disturbing and hard to experience. And, most adults, observe that and recognize, it's really unnatural, and it's, shocking. And so, their first instinct is to stop the behavior. And often that happens through punishment. Our team was really specialized in working with sexually reactive kids. And so we understood this behavior a little differently, but we saw that it was really a way of communicating, of telling us their stories when they didn't actually have words for what had happened to them. And so, of course, we also needed to keep our kids safe, and that meant, stopping those behaviors. but we had to take a much more complex approach to treating these issues. And it started with recognizing them as reenactment behaviors and seeing them as symptoms.
Some of the best examples that came out of that was in Dr. Lenore Terr's book called Too Scared to Cry, How Trauma Affects Children and Ultimately Us All. And that book came out in 1990, so a lot of people won't have heard about it, but she studied the impact of what's called the Chowchilla kidnapping. And this was an event that happened in July of 1976. So a bunch of kidnappers abducted a school bus load of 26 children ages 5 to 14. And they transported them the whole school bus to a quarry in Livermore, California. This took place in Chowchilla, California, and loaded the whole school bus into a buried moving box truck. And after about 16 hours, the driver and the children were able to dig themselves out and they escaped unharmed. So not witnessing any horrible thing, just being really scared and then having to get out of this situation. And police soon made an arrest of the quarry owner's son and his accomplishments, of his accomplices.
Yeah. It's funny, Sandy, I actually just listened to one of my other favorite podcasts, in addition to this one. Obviously, this one's number one, called Crime Junkies, and they covered this case. And so, I was sort of reacquainted with it, and I've also read Lenore Terr's book. And I think a lot like what I was just describing with the kids that my team and I were treating, what Lenore Terr observed was that post-traumatic play in children who've experienced trauma is very literal, very literal. Like, it's so literal that if you actually spot it and see it, you can sort of see or guess or infer what's happened in terms of their trauma exposure. And in hearing about their play, or just not even knowing a lot more about a child, you can predict or postulate what the event might have been. And with the kids in the Chowchilla kidnapping, the way they would behaviorally reenact these unspoken memories made it clear that they were not just changed in their behavior, but their personalities were changed. And we saw that too in my program, like the traumatic experience and then the replication through their play or interactions actually changes the way they relate to people.
An
And you see,
example,
it's not for the better,
it's
right?
not for the better, because that's helped us understand our adults that came into treatment. And it's good to get a couple examples of what she saw, what Dr. Terr saw. One was Sammy, who was 10, who was at the time was considered legally blind. He had glasses on, but he was considered legally blind. And in the schoolyard, without any provocation, he pushed a much smaller girl and slapped her in the face. And he bragged, "I gave them all a rough time. I don't care. It doesn't bother me." Well, what had happened to Sammy was during the kidnapping, he was a previously completely unaggressive child, but he had been so frustrated when the kidnapper took his glasses off that he tried to hit him with his shoe. And so that playground behavior, he was really enacting it, but of course it was hurting a little girl.
Yeah. Another good example was the 14-year-old boy named Bob, who had sort of taken on a role of helper during their escape. And he actually translated his experience of heroism in a really inappropriate way. About 18 months later, he was home. and his family, he was home with his family, and there was a strange vehicle parked near his home, and his parents asked him to go check out what was happening. I think they assumed that, maybe someone had broken down and needed help. But Bob went out and checked the car, and a few minutes later, his parents heard shouting, and they rushed out to see what happened. And it turned out that Bob had actually taken his BB gun and shot a Japanese tourist whose car had broken down right beyond their property. And so what had happened for Bob was that he had this indelible association with heroism, and that fear of strange vehicles, because the broken down car, I think, was a trigger for him. He had associated that with the van that pulled up and actually became, the vehicle where the kidnapping happened. So in his mind, those two things were really linked, and he wasn't going to wait to be kidnapped. He instead shot the tourist as a way of protecting his family. Luckily, the tourist wasn't seriously injured, but I think it really shows us, the way that, experiences and memories get replicated in the present moment.
Absolutely. And fortunately, it was a BB gun and not a real gun. Then there's little Allison, who was 10. When the kidnappers filled the gas tanks of the vans with gasoline, she was asthmatic, and she believed that she was being asphyxiated. She said, people cried, but I cried the most. I felt I couldn't breathe in there. And when they put the gasoline in, it made everybody cough, and I felt I was suffocating at the time. Then 1 year after the kidnapping, this is what her mother related. She said, the new car makes her go crazy. She says in the back of the car, it doesn't get cool enough. She huffs and puffs and says she can't breathe. So long after the kidnapping, fear of further trauma, as Dr. Terra pointed out, continued to operate as this force behind what were really mundane events. And this happened for 21 of the 23 children who went through this. So this was no small thing. And actually, Bessel van der Kolk and others early in the development of the traumatic stress field noted this tendency toward re-victimization of oneself and others related to having been victimized as a child.
We see it in lots of other ways too. There's a lot of research, and statistically we know that victims of rape are more likely to be re-victimized. Victims of domestic violence are more likely to be exposed to more violent relationships, even if they leave their batterers. So that replication shows up in those dynamics too. And I think what's so painful about this dynamic is that people who experience repetitive victimization are often blamed for it. Like that there's something wrong with them and that they can't protect themselves. So, we recognize that this is, traumatic reenactment behavior, but often it's just seen as victim blaming.
Right. And then it's unconscious. And that's really hard for people to understand, that something that appears so systematic and deliberate can be the person can be completely unaware of it. So let's look at what the theories are about what causes this, since it's so important. And there's lots of theories about it. Some focus on how the individual is consciously sometimes or unconsciously motivated, seeking something that they need. So maybe they're trying to master a bad experience or bad feelings. Maybe they want to be punished for something they imagine that they did. Maybe it involves dissociation. So the memories have not been integrated. And so they're trying to make sense of bad things that have happened to them. Maybe they're addicted to the hyperarousal state that goes along with having been really scared. And we know this, we saw lots and lots of people who were self-harming. And maybe the reason for that is that they need to produce pain to help them avoid whatever memory or feeling is coming up, and they want to shut it down by actual physical pain.
So in these, theories, we're sort of looking at the behavior as having a purpose, that there's like some motivational reason for the behavior. But there are also some explanations that are non-motivational, right? That the responses to trauma might produce this replication, even if it's not explicitly desired, or even if it doesn't have some real, positive purpose of protection. The one way that we think about that repetition is through understanding the development of habits and learning roles, right? So that it becomes sort of automatic. Rather than serving a purpose, it's just replicated behavior based on, habit or being cast in a certain role that you're fulfilling. There's also, a theory that has a very behavioral orientation, which is, it's a response to conditioned stimuli. And that comes from, behavioral work that helps us understand the dog and the bell and the food. And, the dog starts salivating when the bell rings because it's associated with food, right? So similarly, when certain experiences have shaped that conditioning for a person, we can see similar, some kind of reenactment behavior happening as a response to a trigger. And then another is that someone might actually just be dissociating from their internal or external warning signs. So they are engaged in the reenactment because they just are not tuned in to the clues that this may be unsafe in some way. And then a fourth is the biologically based preference for the familiar. We know that people prefer the known over the unknown. And that happens even in dangerous situations. So in our work in creating presence, you and I, we talk about, and in our coaching, we focus a lot, spend a lot of time on distinguishing between comfort and safety, because for traumatized people, what's familiar may be comfortable, and that may be what they lean towards, but it may not be safe at all.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Part of the problem in all this, and all of, as you said, all of these explanations may, in different circumstances, have a lot of truth about them. But I think the underlying kind of problem for all of it is that we have this divided brain and it produces a divided mind. So I think the way we learned to think about reenactment behavior with our adult clients, and certainly that the post-traumatic play that you were talking about is really a sign of this, is that it's actually a cry for help. And it's a cry for help from the part of the mind, what we now call the unconscious mind, which we now think is actually the right hemisphere of our brain largely, that it's a cry for help from that part of our mind, because that part of our mind doesn't really have words. So it can't verbally explain what's happening. And instead, it can only express itself through behavioral signals. So we really have two memory systems, verbal and nonverbal. And so when people experience a trauma, they enter this state called speechless terror, where there's a loss of language and those pieces of memories, whether they're images or smells or sensations, all of the things that become triggers later, they don't have any words attached to them. And so later, those, as the mind is signaling for help, because it looks like in an evolutionary sense, our minds are meant to be integrated so that we have access to all of the history of our experience. So the way that happens is through behavioral reenactments, through flashbacks of all sorts. And that's, really it's hugely important, because whatever you can't remember, you can't learn from. So
Right.
instead, you keep repeating the same stuff.
You've described it to me in a way that I think really resonates. When we first started working together, you used the example of it being like using Morse code, right? So if somebody's in trouble and they're sending a message that like dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, 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 right? The universal signal for help, they need to keep repeating it until somebody comes to help them. And so that's what these behaviors really are. They're messages of distress. But often we're just labeling their behavior as problematic, and trying to make it go away without really understanding the meaning of the message, right? That behavior is their Morse code. Um, and when we label it that way, we really just make them feel more helpless, more upset, more frustrated, and then they have to up the ante, right? So the behavior often becomes even more problematic than when it started, because in behavioral terms, they're like trying to turn up the volume
Yeah.
on those dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot signals.
Exactly. They got to start screaming
Right.
for help, because it's not coming. I mean, getting a label, a diagnostic label, and then another one on top of that, and then another one on top of that, doesn't lead anywhere. It does not explain, well, where is this coming from? What is this about? And that's why we have that phrase, about you got to ask, you got to shift from thinking about what's wrong with the other person to actually kind of trying to figure out with them, well, what happened? As Lenore Terr demonstrated, if this goes on, and you mentioned earlier, the person's personality is damaged by not getting the response they need from their social world. So the language of the nonverbal mind is action, it's enactment, it's behavior. So a really critical component of creating presence is enactment, embodiment, and enactment as one of the E's, right? Because human beings, we reenact our past everywhere, and we cue each other to play roles in our own personal dramas. It's what makes psychodrama so vital as a therapeutic modality. Traumatic reenactment is a replaying of a traumatic event in everyday life, and important to underscore, it's out of the person's awareness.
Yeah. And I think we talk a lot about this phenomenon of reenactment as a psychological process, but it's just as much a biological process. And understanding more about how human brain development works has helped us really understand that.
Yeah, and that gets us to what happens with newborns from beginning when we're born. Even newborns 41 minutes old can begin to imitate rudimentary manual and facial gestures. It's innate. We're born with it. We don't learn to imitate. We learn by imitating, because we have these mirror neurons in our brain, so that when we perceive the sound like of a peanut being broken, we also activate in our brain automatically the motor plan necessary to break the peanut ourselves. So it's as if the only way we can actually recognize that sound is by simulating it or internally imitating it in our own brain. the action that then produces that sound. So mirror neurons help us reenact in our brain the intentions of other people, and it gives us a profound understanding of their mental states. Problem is, our emotions are very contagious. So the tendency to just automatically mimic and then synchronize our facial expressions and our voices and our postures and our movements with other people means that we automatically converge emotionally. And if it's a joyful emotion, that can be really nice. If it's not so much, if it's anger, that can really be a problem.
Yeah, another way to think about it is through self-fulfilling prophecies, which basically means, we form certain expectations of people and events, and then we communicate those expectations with certain behavioral cues, and then people respond to those cues by adjusting their behavior to match them. And then the result is that the original expectation becomes the outcome. It's like that experiment where Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson back in 1968 gave all the children in 18 classrooms a test, and then told the teachers that 20% of them were, intellectual bloomers, even though they actually were completely average. And at the end of, the school year, the teachers tested the children again, and the kids in the experimental group showed an average gain of 2 points in their verbal ability, 7 points in reasoning, and 4 points in their overall IQ. So simply having an expectation of somebody and then treating them in alignment with that expectation influences their behavior. And this can be really good, like the outcomes for these kids, but it can also work in a really toxic way. And so we're going to talk more about that when we come back from our break. So thanks for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, we'll talk more about how reenactment plays out in relationships. We'll be right back after these messages.
In a world with trauma, adversity, and mental health deficits, your organization may be feeling the effects in its culture. Recognizing the need for safe, productive, and values-aligned organizations, Creating Presence can help to develop a healthy, biocratic organization. In the Creating Presence training model, your entire staff will learn to value human elements that characterize organizations, learn values that are solution-based and supportive, and implement new skills which will create capable leaders to meet the needs of staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And today, we're focusing on traumatic reenactment, our tendency to keep repeating the same patterns over and over again in relationships, even when the outcome is always bad. And in this segment, what to do about it. So entire systems, it's important to understand, must achieve this shift, including patients that we've been talking about earlier, interpreting resistance to change from a really changed perspective, understanding what reenactment is really about. And that means kind of shifting the whole conversation to and understanding all of this as a piece of drama, a play that is unfolding in our lives, and using that, what's called the drama triangle, as a way to get out of these really bad situations.
Yeah, that the drama triangle is the foundation of understanding reenactment and also for disrupting reenactment when it's toxic. And it's a psychological phenomenon, and it was developed by Dr. Stephen Karpman. But I love the story that he actually developed this kind of complex understanding by watching basketball, which I mean, Sandy, I'm really short. I'm 5'3" on a good day, in a family of giants. So basketball was our, it was our sport. I'm sad to report my basketball dreams ended in fourth grade when everybody shot up 6 more inches than I did. Um, but he was watching and studying fakes, right? So in basketball, when you pretend to pass or shoot the ball in order to kind of distract the defender, and then shift your body and go in the opposite direction. And he was trying to understand like how how that could work. He also was looking at football, which I don't care about. Really, it's about basketball for me. That's the part of the story I'm most invested in. But in his own words, he described it as like he was doodling with some circles and symbols and trying to figure out ways that, the offense could outsmart the defense. And he sort of arrived at this understanding of, what we now understand as this drama triangle.
Yeah, well, his father was a psychoanalyst who had worked in a psychiatric prison hospital, I think in Russia, because he was Russian, and he studied with Freud, and he opened up a whole new field of criminal psychoanalysis. So that's where that were the origins for Stephen Karpman. But Dr. Karpman had attended a guy named Eric Burns' Tuesday night seminars. Eric Burns is the guy that wrote I'm Okay, You're Okay.
Yeah.
People might have heard of that. He was a Canadian-born psychiatrist who really created the notion of transactional analysis to explain human behavior, and made the notion of human behavior much more accessible and understandable in everyday terms. So the first time Karpman really published about this, he called it Fairy Tales and Script Drama Analysis, and that is in 1968. And after he showed Dr. Byrne his original theory, Byrne said, write it up, and people will be quoting you for 200 years. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's probably true. At least this long later, the drama triangle is as useful today as it was then.
So the drama triangle is really a social model of human interaction, and it maps the type of destructive interactions that can occur whenever people are in conflict. It's also been called the victim triangle because once somebody enters into this triangle in one role, that person is destined to end up playing all 3 roles, and the roles really depend on each other.
Right, exactly. Victim, persecutor, rescuer. Let me talk a little bit about how it works. So, as we said before, being human, emotions are contagious, we're especially susceptible to anger and fear on somebody else's part because of our evolutionary history of being in danger a lot. So it was in our best interest to spot anger and fear. So we do that really quickly. But that makes it more likely that my responses to a situation will make you angry, right? If I'm angry, you're more likely to be angry. And it's so contagious that we end up in a really bad situation very quickly.
So what would happen, Sandy, if you're angry actually from something that happened in the past and you're engaging with me, something that I'm doing or some response that I'm giving you may actually recreate that past for you?
Exactly. And it happens really fast, and we're completely unconscious when it's happened that it has some relationship to the past. It's just, as far as we know, you're doing something that's making me angry. And maybe you are, or maybe it's just your face looks angry and you're responding in a way because of what I'm projecting. I mean, it's so confusing. And then so really quickly, we take on a role. So you get angry at me, then I start seeing you as persecuting me, and then I'm a victim. And then very quickly, we can shift roles until you're feeling like a victim and I'm the persecutor. That can happen instantly. So all three of these very powerful, unproductive, and toxic roles are roles we frequently find ourselves in. So an example, simple example, a mom and her young son are arguing because his room's a mess, right? Kind of typical. Dad then comes home from work and says, oh, look, he's had a long day at school. Leave him alone. Mom then is the persecutor, the son is the victim, and dad is the rescuer, right? And what follows, that can go on and on and on. That can happen every day over and over again. Or it can quickly shift to a change of roles where dad turns on mom and their son then tries to rescue mom because everybody keeps switching these roles.
Yeah, it sounds very familiar to me. And I think for our listeners, right, if you think about your own life, you probably have played one or all of these roles at some point in your experience too. And it's uncomfortable to admit that we're so vulnerable to getting pulled into this triangle. But it's really helpful if we're willing to acknowledge it, because then we can disrupt it. And this happens in organizations, not just in family, not just in my house, Sandy, but it happens with staff members, leaders, clients. I mean, it is really at the center of what we see in our creating presence coaching with our organizations, that this triangle is just being enacted all the time and leading to unproductive conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, it's to get trapped in this is terrible. So let's look more closely at the roles, the different roles. So when you're in the persecutor role, you want to try to fix things forcefully. You really think you know what you're doing, and you are often called a villain or a tormentor or a betrayer or an oppressor or an accuser. It's the role of a persecutor is to blame. It's shame-based. It's the critical parent. So there must always be something right, and by blaming, the persecutor completely gets on. It has nothing to do with me. You're doing something wrong. So they criticize and blame all the time.
Yeah, and there is often sort of an experience for people who are vulnerable to this role of having been mistreated in some way. Sometimes that's mental or physical abuse as a child, but it doesn't have to be. But persecutors are often people who are sort of have internalized some anger about being mistreated and decided that they are never going to be victimized again. And instead, to taken on this way of embodying a survivor role by, doing the opposite. And their persecution is really a way of protecting themselves and almost like making the first strike, like hurting or being the on the offense instead of waiting for something to happen to them.
Yeah, definitely doing anything you can not to be the victim. Right. They don't really try when you're in that role, you don't really try to solve problems. It's really using power quite negatively and can be really destructive. Putting down others, you're not okay. I'm okay, but you're not okay. And it's a way of defending against vulnerability. If the persecutor doesn't keep the victim oppressed, the victim might rise up, and then the persecutor doesn't have a role to play anymore. So if a victim leaves the triangle, what do you do with all that energy? So this role is the most extreme of the three, although you can also find quite passive aggressive persecutors, and it isn't necessarily overt aggression. It can be very passive aggressive.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that it is not always like an internal personal manifestation. Sometimes people, and we see this a lot in our organizations, because people are in leadership roles or they have a lot of authority. There's something about that, the dynamics that play out that sort of places them there. And so they may find themselves acting in ways that are really not aligned with who they feel like they are. Sort of more aggressive or more critical than they feel like they normally would be. But the essence of the role is that persecutors deny their own weakness, and their fear is powerlessness, and so they kind of need to focus on someone else, as who's sort of potentially weaker than they are.
Yeah, so if you're in a leadership position in an organization, you need to be able to recognize when you may be being pulled into the persecutor role. So if you're disparaging other people's worth, if you're discounting other people's value and their integrity, if you find yourself, just getting so angry, you want to just knock somebody down, you're really, your aggression is going up. You're being more and more judgmental and critical and blaming and shaming and hurting other people. It means you're probably being pulled into a reenactment of that some other part of the organization is playing the victim role and another will play the rescuer role. And you need to become conscious of that and aware of that to get out of that dangerous situation.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated because I think I've told you, people in my job call me Mary Poppins. Like, I am the, most, the least intimidating person you can come across. But there have been times when I have found myself really embodying all of the things that you just described. And that's not me. That's not who I am. But the role, that replication of this drama triangle is so strong that, even if you know about it, even if you have worked hard to, be aligned with your values, you can find yourself falling into it and playing this out. Another role is the rescuer role. And it sounds much better because the word is not as pejorative, right? But it is equally dangerous, because rescuers save people without being asked. And they sort of take on responsibility for the victim. And they want to caretake other people, which is good in some ways. But the way it plays out in the drama triangle is that they are doing it in a way that sort of feeds their own ego or creates like a martyr syndrome, and they're neglecting their own needs or taking responsibility for them. And there's sort of an underlying belief that if I take care of other people, eventually I will be taken care of. And that doesn't always happen, and especially in the drama triangle, it does not happen. And sometimes people who are more vulnerable to this role are people who haven't necessarily had their needs met when they were younger.
And the results, we see this a lot in our organizations. The rescuers are overworked, tired, trapped, caught, like you said, they're in a martyr role while this resentment is building underneath the surface. So it is often called a shadow aspect of the mother principle, but instead of actual support and nurturing, it becomes really controlling and smothering. And it's a misguided understanding of how you actually empower somebody who's in the victim role. And they actually can't allow the victim to get out of that role to get better, because then the victim would leave the triangle, which should stop their ability to rescue.
Yeah, the thing about the rescuer role that makes it so dangerous is not only that their actions are disempowering to the victim, but also because they are doomed to fail. And we call it the rescuer role, but when I'm talking with our organizations about it, I often call it the failed rescuer role, because it's so important, I think, to highlight that because the dynamic is about replication of trauma and the trauma happened, the person who is in the rescuer role is doomed to fail. Their efforts are never going to be enough. That's the essence of the triangle. So we recognize that because people feel really burnt out because they are never feeling successful. The rescuing isn't working. They often feel taken advantage of and resentful. And there's often a discounting of other people's ability to think for themselves. We sometimes talk about failed rescuers with the term enabler. That's another way of describing it. And there is like a rescuing even when that rescuing isn't needed. So it's like someone who's always kind of stepping in, taking over, and experiencing guilt if they're not doing that rescuing. There's an underlying fear that they may not be needed. And so they're sort of fostering dependence.
Right, exactly. And then the third role is the victim role. So victims are overwhelmed by their own vulnerability. And again, underscoring what you just said, that this is all related to something that is long past. And they're reenacting these patterns because the help they need hasn't actually happened. So they can't really take responsibility for their own situation and what's going on, because they don't really know what it's about. It's not conscious. So they've got a real problem with making decisions, solving problems, finding really much pleasure in life, or understanding how this is all working. It just keeps unfolding over and over again.
Yeah, and the role that you were talking about, like those shadow roles, is the wounded inner child role, the innocent, vulnerable, needy part of us. And that can create crippling dependence on primary relationships. And it can stem from crippling dependence on primary relationships that feel broken and unfixable. And eventually, the victim becomes so tired that they will look to level the playing field. And that means often becoming a persecutor. So blaming others or becoming a rescuer. Like rather than focusing on their own needs, they will look for someone else who's more vulnerable and try to engage in that way.
Right. So how can you recognize the victim role? Well, somebody that's disparaging themselves, they discount themselves, they avoid responsibilities, and that makes them feel again that they're not carrying on as an adult. Feelings of powerlessness, hopelessness, being broken, being unfixable, like you mentioned, feeling trapped, stuck, downtrodden, helpless, complaining of their own unmet needs, feeling dejected, acting really immature, acting like a child, and saying, "Oh, there's nothing I can do. I can't solve this. This is I can't. There's not any possibility of me actually rising to the occasion."
So we've given an example earlier, and I think it might make a lot of sense now for us to sort of talk about how we disrupt it. What do we do to, change this dynamic?
Yeah.
Because it is so toxic.
Well, the first step, of course, is knowing that you're in this situation. So you're going to have to change the script, and thinking of it like a play is really useful. And then finding out what your automatic role is likely to be. And then really asking, do I want to be reactive or do I want to feel empowered?
Yeah. And another part is improv. Really being willing to change the script. Like once you realize and recognize that this triangular dynamic is happening, knowing that the only way to shift it is by doing something different. Because if this is a replication of the past, you're going to keep following the same script.
Exactly. So whatever you improvise, when you're in this, whatever you're going to do to change it, it almost doesn't matter. You can do almost anything, but it won't be comfortable. It won't feel right because you're now so accustomed to this triangle. So the roles need to change. You have to think of what your fixed role is, think of it differently. So the persecutor becomes the challenger. And accept that you're in this situation, you got to be the bad guy, you've been blamed, you kept the victim a victim. So your first step is the hardest one, the one that's most uncomfortable, but you got to break out of it. So you got to remain firm, but fair, assertive, not aggressive. See the victim as a person and challenge them instead of blaming them. Holding them to account, but also being willing to really create a much more fair and equal relationship.
I've found when I've been in this role, there are two things that have really helped me break out of it. One is apologizing. And sometimes it's hard when we don't feel like we've done something wrong, but like changing the tone by saying, I'm really sorry that my words had this effect on you. And the other is to ask for partnership. Like I use the word partnership, like I want to be your partner in changing this. And that can really, just that language shift can be helpful.
Exactly. And the rescuer needs to become a coach. This phrase is most useful for breaking out of the rescuer role. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Right. So the really first step is for the rescuer is asking the victim, what do you really want?
Yeah.
And the third way that to get out of this is the victim has to become a creator. So if you're in the victim role, you got to accept your vulnerability and become a problem solver and aim for being a survivor. So that means learning problem solving techniques, learning how to mediate, asking yourself, what can I do to fix this? To be more outcome oriented, less problem oriented, creating a gratitude list of things that are good in your life. I can do this. And the first step is to identify one practical and easy step you can take towards the outcome that you want.
Yeah, I've found with both of those roles that language changes are really helpful too. I mean, I think as a social worker, as a therapist, I'm really vulnerable to being in the rescuer role. And so one of the things that I've sort of trained myself to do is to ask someone who I'm engaged in within the victim role what's your plan? What's your plan towards a resolution for this? Can I be a sounding board? Do you need help brainstorming rather than taking over? And then for shifting from victim to creator, I think in my experience, because I hate to admit it, but I've also been in the victim role for sure, being willing to tolerate discomfort, and saying like I want to share what's happening, this concern that I have, and I also feel like I can contribute. I want to make some suggestions, right? So just thinking about shifting language can be really helpful. Thank you so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week. Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to lead in a trauma-informed organization. Have a great week and we'll see you then. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com.